I never thought I would talk about this again. For years I buried it in the deepest part of me, the part where we keep things that don't fit with the version of reality we want to maintain. I am a rational person. I studied graphic design. I work in front of a screen. I live in an apartment on the fourth floor overlooking a noisy street. My life is concrete, measurable, and yet there is something that happened to me 4 years ago that has no explanation that satisfies me. It all started because of a freelance job. I was going through a tough time financially. I had just ended a long relationship. I had to leave the apartment I shared with my ex, and I was living with my mother while I reorganized my life. When a proposal came to me that seemed too good to be true, I didn't think twice. A regional tourism agency needed someone to photograph rural towns in the south. 2 weeks of travel, good pay, independent work. Perfect. I arrived in Llangken, as I will call the town, on a Tuesday in April. The south of Chile in autumn has a beauty that hurts. The trees change color in a way that seems exaggerated, as if nature were competing with the painting. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke. When the minibus stopped in the town square, I breathed in that air and thought, I am going to be fine here. I stayed at a boarding house run by a lady named Esther. She was a woman in her 70s, petite, with white hair tied up in a bun, and a smile that seemed to hold something. Not necessarily something bad, just something she knew that I did not. The first few days were perfect. I would wake up early, have breakfast with Esther, and go out for walks with my camera. People were shy at first, but friendly. Several invited me to drink mate while telling me stories about the place. It was during those conversations that I began to hear her name, Doña Clementina. The first time I heard it was almost in passing. A lady named Rosa, who had a store full of spices and homemade preserves, mentioned it while she was talking to me about certain festivities in the village. I asked her who it was. Rosa stopped arranging the jars she had in her hand. He lives on the edge of the forest, she said, at the end of the dirt road that goes out to the north, and she changed the subject. The second time was the next day. Father Ignacio, the village priest, a young and nervous man, asked me what areas I had visited. I mentioned that I was thinking of heading north. There's a house at the end of that road, he said carefully. An older woman. I wouldn't recommend spending too much time around there. Doña Clementina, I said without thinking. Father Ignacio looked at me. Who told you that name? Rosa, from the store. He nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. Just be careful, he said. That's all. Of course, that did exactly the opposite of dissuading me. The next day I took the dirt road north. The forest was extraordinary. Tall araucarias, coihus covered in moss, a silence filled with small sounds. I took photos for hours, so absorbed that I didn't realize how far I had walked. When I looked up, I saw the house. It was made of dark wood, darker than the others in the village, as if it had been exposed to the rain for many more years. It had a garden in front that was an explosion of plants growing with no apparent logic. Some I recognized, lavender, rosemary, something that looked like rue. Others were plants I had never seen before, with oddly shaped leaves and flowers in colors that did not match the season. I was photographing the garden from a distance when I heard the voice. What are you photographing, girl? I jumped. At the edge of the garden stood an old woman who hadn't been there a second before. Small, hunched, with dark wrinkled skin like tanned leather, and eyes of a color I couldn't describe. They weren't black, they weren't brown. They were a dark amber, almost golden, that shone strangely under the light filtered by the clouds. The garden, I said. I'm a photographer, doing a job for the tourism agency. The old woman looked at me for a long moment, then she smiled. Valentina, she said. I was frozen. How do you know my name? The village is small, she said. We know who arrives. It was a reasonable answer, and yet something in the way she said it, without asking, without hesitation, as if she had already known before seeing me, made me uncomfortable, which I tried to ignore. I'm Clementina, she said. Come in for something warm, it's cold. I should have said no. I should have listened to Father Ignacio, to Rosa, who with their silences had clearly warned me. But I went in. The house inside was warm and dark. The wood stove was lit, the intense smell of herbs and something smoky and something sweet that I couldn't identify. The walls were covered with shelves filled with glass jars of all sizes, containing colors ranging from dark green to almost black red. Bunches of dried plants hung from the ceiling. On a wooden table, several open books with handwritten notes and drawings that I couldn't see well from where I sat. Clementina prepared tea for me in a handmade ceramic cup of a very deep blue color. The tea had a flavor I didn't recognize, slightly bitter at first, and then sweet, with a floral aroma that I found pleasant. We talked for almost 2 hours. Clementina spoke about medicinal plants, remedies that her mother had taught her, about how the forest had a memory that humans had forgotten how to read, that certain places had an ancient energy, neither good nor bad, and that those who knew how to relate to it could do things that others called miracles or magic depending on the direction of the wind. When I left, the sun was low and I felt light, like after a conversation with someone who really listens to you. That night, while reviewing the photos on my laptop, I noticed something. In a picture of Clementina's garden, taken just before she spoke to me, there was a figure at the edge of the bushes, the hunched silhouette of the old woman, with something in her hand that looked like a long staff. But I clearly remembered that when I took that photo, the garden was empty. I remembered it because I had checked the framing several times looking for the perfect angle. There was no one there. I enlarged the image as much as I could. The figure was unmistakable. I closed the laptop and tried not to think about it anymore. The eye lies sometimes. Photos capture things that the brain filters out. There are explanations. But that night I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was in the forest, and the forest was different, darker, denser, with trees that did not correspond to any real species. The ground was covered with something black and shiny. In a clearing next to a small campfire was Clementina. She was holding something in her hands, the blue cup from which I had drunk the tea. She looked directly at me, with eyes that I knew belonged to something that was also looking outward. "It has already begun," she said. I woke up at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding in my chest. The room was completely dark, except for the rain hitting the zinc roof. I stayed still, listening. Beneath the rain, mixed with it in a way that made it hard to separate, there was a sound, a murmur, like someone speaking very softly just on the other side of my door. A woman's voice, old, repeating something in a constant pattern, like a prayer. I got up without turning on the light, walked to the door, and put my hand on the doorknob. I stayed like that, listening. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was different from normal silence. It had weight, as if the air itself had become thicker. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. A dim bulb illuminated the wooden floor and the other closed doors. But on the ground, in front of my door, there was something. A small bundle, dried herbs, dark seeds, a piece of cloth, all tied with a red thread. I looked at it from above without touching it for a long moment. Then I stepped back and closed the door. The next morning when Esther brought me breakfast, I asked her if she had heard anything in the hallway during the night. She slowly set down the tray. She looked at me. "Did you go see Clementina yesterday?" she asked. "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because that bundle is hers. It's what she does when she wants something from someone." "What does she want?" Esther sat down in front of me. Something she had never done. She always left the breakfast and went away. "Clementina is what they call a flyer in the village," she said. "Do you know what that is?" I had heard the term. In southern Chile, there exists that myth. Women who make pacts with dark forces in exchange for power. The name comes from the belief that they can transform during the night, an ancient legend, predating Catholicism, part of the local folklore. "That's a myth," I said. Esther looked at me with the patience of someone who has seen too much to argue. "She has been in this town for 40 years, she said. "She arrived when she was young. I knew her. She has changed, and the town has changed with her. Animals dying for no reason, people getting sick and no one knows why. The people know, but no one talks because they fear what could happen to them. And Father Ignacio? He has been here for 2 years. The previous priest left without warning after 6 months." I fell silent. "What does the bundle mean?" Esther pressed her lips together. "That marked you. That wants you to come back." I spent the next day without leaving the boarding house, under the pretext of editing photos. But the truth was that I was scared, a fear that I didn't quite know how to face. At 6 in the evening, someone knocked on my door. It was a girl, about 12 years old, long dark hair, a serious expression that didn't match her age. Doña Clementina wants you to go tonight, she said without greeting. Who sent you? She did, and she left. That night I didn't go. I stayed in the room with the light on until I fell asleep with my clothes on. The second dream was worse, complete darkness in the forest, and I knew, with that strange certainty of dreams, that something was moving around me. I couldn't see it. I could feel it. The weight of a presence that was not human, circling around me like an animal studying its prey. And then Clementina, in front of me, so close that I could see the reflection of something non-existent in her amber eyes. I didn't come, I told her. It doesn't matter anymore, she said. You're here now. And in the dream I understood what she meant, that the here was not the forest, that it was something she had placed in me, that the tea was not just tea. I woke up screaming. Esther was knocking on my door. You need to leave the village, she told me when I opened. Tomorrow morning. I left the next day. I paid for the boarding house, stuffed everything into my backpack without organizing it, and took the first transport to the city. I looked out the window the whole way, watching the forest recede. I thought that distance would solve everything. It didn't. The nightmares continued for weeks. Clementina appeared in my dreams with a regularity that had no explanation. Not always in the forest, sometimes in my apartment, standing in front of the window, looking outside as if waiting for something. Sometimes in the cafe where I worked, on the street in front of my mother's house. Always still, always with those eyes. And I began to notice other things. Objects that I remembered placing in one spot that appeared in another. The feeling, upon entering a room, that someone had just left. A smell that sometimes came without apparent reason. Herbs, something smoky, something sweet. The exact smell of Clementina's house. I went to a psychologist. She told me it was mild post-traumatic stress, that my mind was processing the experience in ways that seemed supernatural, but had neurological explanations. She gave me exercises for anxiety. The exercises didn't work. 3 months after returning, I found the bundle. It was in the inner pocket of my work backpack, the one I used every day. The same type of bundle. Dried herbs, seeds, cloth, red thread. But it wasn't the same. It was a new one. I placed it on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then I threw it down the sink, crushing it with my fingers until it broke into pieces. The smell that was released when it opened was exactly the smell of Clementina's house. That night I had the worst dream up to that point. The forest had light, but it was a light that came from below, from the very ground, as if something beneath the earth were burning. And in that light, I saw what Clementina really was, what was hidden beneath the form of the hunched old woman. I am not going to describe what I saw, not because I can't, but because there are things that lose something when put into words. What I saw had no name in any language I know. It was ancient, it was enormous, and it looked at me with something that, if I had to give it a name, I would call hunger. I woke up and vomited. I called Esther the next day. I told her everything, the dreams, the objects, the smell, the bundle in the backpack. Esther remained silent for a long moment. I was afraid this would happen, she said. There is a person who can help you. A woman who lives on the other side of the village, near the lake. Her name is Sophia. She knows about these things. Why didn't you tell me before I left? Because I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. I returned to the village 2 weeks later. I know it seems counterproductive, but what Esther explained to me, what Sophia would later confirm, was that distance does not break this kind of bond. Running away doesn't help. What Clementina weaves, she weaves into you, not in the place. Sophia was a woman in her 50s, tall, with short gray hair, and a direct expression that contrasted with everything I expected. There was no artificial mystery about her. She made me sit down, served me water, asked me to tell everything from the beginning, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded as if what I had described confirmed something she already knew. The tea, he said. She gave you something in the tea. Not poisonous, a bond. It's what they do to anchor someone. Anchor for what? Sophia took a moment. Clementina has been feeding off something we produce unknowingly for decades. Fear, disorientation, that energy that comes out when someone can't sleep and doesn't understand why. She chooses them. Not everyone, some. Those who have something that interests her. How is it broken? It's not easily broken, but it can be weakened until she loses interest. You have to take away her sustenance. What sustenance? The fear. Sophia said, "If you stop being afraid, she loses the thread, not immediately, but over time." I stayed looking at her. "Are you telling me that the solution is to not be afraid?" I know it sounds simple. It's not. I'm not talking about pretending. I'm talking about reaching a point where you genuinely accept what exists and don't give it the energy of your terror. I spent 3 days with Sophia. We did things that at another time in my life would have seemed ridiculous to me. Cleaning my belongings with plants that Sophia grew, which smelled exactly the opposite of Clementina's plants. Basil, rue, something like pine and lemon. A long meditation in which Sophia asked me to imagine the thread that Clementina had put in me, to see it thinning, losing color, becoming transparent. On the third day, Sophia told me something I didn't expect. "You need to see her." "No," I said immediately. "Not to talk to her, just to see her, so that your brain registers that she is an old person in a small house, not the monster that has been building up in your dreams. Fear feeds on the image you have of her, which grew larger in your absence. Seeing her in reality reduces it." I didn't want to do it. I spent an entire night turning it over in my mind. But the next day, I went. I walked down the dirt path toward the forest. The garden was the same. The plants in their unruly explosion, the strange colors for the season. Clementina was sitting on a wooden bench in front of the door, looking down the path, as if she were waiting for me. I stayed at a distance. I just looked at her. She was an old woman, small, with a hunched back under the weight of the years. Her amber eyes found mine and held there, and in that gaze, there was something I recognized from dreams, that ancient and hungry thing. But it was also just a gaze, the gaze of an elderly person in a garden. I didn't say anything, she didn't either. After a minute, I turned around and went back the way I had come. That night I slept without dreaming for the first time in months. The dreams took weeks to completely disappear, and the smell still appears sometimes, in moments I don't expect, when I'm doing something completely mundane. When it happens, I breathe, I recognize it, and I don't give it more than it deserves. 6 months ago, I stopped dreaming of Clementina. I don't know if that means it's over. Sophia told me that these bonds don't completely break, that they weaken until they become harmless. I don't know if that's true or if it's simply what I needed to hear in order to function. What I do know is this: there is something in certain places and certain people that doesn't fit into the version of reality we are taught. I don't care what name we give it. What matters to me is that it is real, and that some people know how to use it. I was lucky. I found Sophia. I returned in time. But sometimes, when the wind brings that smell for no apparent reason, I wonder if luck was enough. If the thread really weakened, or if it just became invisible. And on those nights I sleep with the light on, although it doesn't help me as much as I would like anymore. That was all Valentina wanted to share. She wrote to me at the end of her message that she hopes someone else has gone through something similar, that they don't feel alone in this. If you know the folklore of the South, if you've heard about the voladoras, or if something similar has happened to you, tell me in the comments. I love reading what you all experience. And if you are not subscribed to the channel yet, consider doing so. There are many more stories like this waiting. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. I received this account from a follower named Lucia, who worked as a night librarian at a private university in Montevideo, Uruguay. What she found during an inventory of ancient books in the basement and the consequences of opening a sealed grimoire forced her to leave not only her job but the entire city. If you have ever worked with ancient books or forbidden manuscripts and felt that some pages should not be read, let me know in the comments. This is the story of Lucia and the book that released something that had been waiting for centuries. My name is Lucia, and for 5 years I worked as a librarian at San Ignacio University in Montevideo. It wasn't a large university, but it had an impressive library, especially its collection of rare books and ancient manuscripts dating back to the colonial period. My job was mainly administrative, cataloging new acquisitions, assisting students with research, maintaining order in the reading rooms. But once a year, during the summer holidays when the university was almost empty, I was assigned a special task: taking inventory of the rare book collection in the library's basement. It was a tedious job, but one I enjoyed. I spent days alone in the basement, surrounded by books that were hundreds of years old, some so ancient that you had to wear white gloves to handle them. There were Bibles from the 16th century, obsolete scientific treatises, collections of poetry by forgotten authors, and my favorite, natural history books with hand-drawn illustrations of plants and animals. Last summer, during my 5th annual inventory, I found something that was not in any catalog. I was in the farthest section of the basement, behind shelves that probably hadn't been moved in decades. There was a wooden box, old and covered in dust, so thick that I had to wipe it with a cloth to see what was engraved on the lid. The engravings were strange symbols, not religious in the traditional Catholic sense, but something older. Circles within circles, stars with too many points, words in what seemed to be Latin but distorted. The box was locked with a rusty iron padlock. I searched for a key in the library archives, but there was no record of this box at all. It was as if someone had hidden it there and then erased all evidence of its existence. My professional curiosity overcame my caution. I used a pry bar to break the padlock. Inside the box, wrapped in black fabric that disintegrated at the touch, was a book. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a modern notebook, 20 centimeters by 15, but it was thick, at least 300 pages, bound in what seemed to be dark leather that felt strangely warm to the touch. The cover had a single symbol engraved in gold that still shone after what must have been centuries. And when I opened the book, I felt something. A pull, as if something inside was happy to finally be discovered. The first pages were in Latin. I could read enough to understand that it was some kind of grimoire, a book of ritual magic. The date on the first page said 1624, and the author identified himself only as Brother Augusto of the Order of Seekers. There were diagrams of ritual circles, lists of ingredients for potions and ointments, instructions for invoking and controlling lesser spirits, and in the later sections, something darker, rituals for opening doors between realms and trading with the hungry. As a librarian and historian, I knew that these books existed. 17th century Europe was obsessed with the occult, alchemy, and magic, but I had never seen one firsthand. What made this book particularly unusual was that approximately 2/3 of its pages were sealed, literally sealed with red wax that had been melted between the pages, sticking them together. And on the wax, there were stamped symbols similar to those on the cover. On the last unsealed page, there was a warning written in ancient Spanish. Whoever reads beyond this point invokes what they cannot control. The sealed pages contain knowledge forbidden by order of the Holy Inquisition. They were sealed with protection rituals and must remain so until the end of time. May God have mercy on the soul of whoever breaks these seals. I should have stopped my research there. I should have catalogued the book as a dangerous historical artifact and locked it away. But there was something in those sealed pages that called to me, a curiosity that went beyond the professional, that felt almost like compulsion. Over the next few days, I researched everything I could about Brother Augusto and the Order of Seekers. I found very little. There were vague references in Spanish Inquisition documents about a heretical order that operated secretly in the American colonies in the early 17th century. They supposedly practiced ceremonial magic by mixing Catholicism with indigenous traditions and occult knowledge brought from Europe. The order was pursued and destroyed around 1630. Its members were executed and their books burned. Apparently, this grimoire had survived, hidden, forgotten for almost 400 years. And now it was in my hands. On the night of the summer solstice, alone in the basement of the library at 2 in the morning, I made the stupidest decision of my life. I decided to open the sealed pages. I used a knife to carefully pry under the wax, trying not to damage the paper underneath. The seals resisted. The wax was harder than it looked. But eventually they began to give way. When I broke the first seal, I felt a change in the air. The temperature in the basement dropped noticeably. My breath became visible. And I heard something. A whisper, barely audible, as if someone were speaking from very far away. I continued. I broke the second seal, the third, the fourth. With each broken seal, the whisper grew louder, clearer. I still couldn't understand the words, but there were definitely voices. Multiple voices speaking at the same time in languages I didn't recognize. Finally, all the sealed pages were open. I spread them carefully and began to read. What those pages contained was disturbing. They were not just rituals, they were contracts, written agreements between Brother Augusto and entities he called the Hungry of the Threshold, entities that existed in a plane adjacent to ours, feeding on vital energy, waiting for opportunities to cross. The described rituals were not to briefly invoke these entities to ask questions or request favors. They were to open permanent doors for them, to give them anchors in our world in exchange for power. And on the last sealed page, there was a specific ritual, the ritual of the dark mirror summoning. According to the text, this ritual would open a stable portal that would allow the hungry to cross freely between worlds. Brother Augusto never completed the ritual. There was a note in the margin saying that the Inquisition had discovered his plans and that he was being hunted. He sealed the pages in the hope that someday, someone worthy would find them and complete his work. As I read this, the whispering voices had become clear. They spoke in ancient Spanish now, directly in my mind. Finally, someone has broken the seals. Complete the ritual, Lucia. Open the door for us. I froze. They knew my name. How could they know my name? We have been waiting, watching through the cracks between worlds. We have seen you work in this place. We chose you. You are curious, intelligent, and ambitious enough to want more than what life has given you. It was true. I had been frustrated with my career. 5 years in the same position, with no promotions, no real recognition of my work. I had started to feel like my life was stagnant. Complete the ritual and we will give you knowledge, power, the ability to change your reality. Everything Brother Augusto sought and more. You just need to open the door. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding wildly. No, I was not going to perform any ritual from a 17th century magic book. This was ridiculous. The voices were probably hallucinations caused by working too many hours in a poorly ventilated basement. But when I tried to get up to leave, I found that I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond, and the book in my lap opened by itself, the pages turning until it reached the ritual of the dark mirror summoning. Read it, the voices commanded. Read the ritual aloud. It's all you need to do. Just words. What harm can simple words do? My mouth opened, and without my conscious intention, I began to read. The words flowed from me in Latin, a Latin I didn't know I could speak. My voice echoed strangely in the basement, creating echoes that shouldn't exist in that space. And as I read, things began to happen. The basement lights flickered and dimmed. Shadows in the corners grew deeper, more solid. And in the large mirror hanging on the back wall of the basement, used to check that the books were properly positioned on the shelves, something began to appear. At first it was just a distortion on the surface of the mirror, like ripples in calm water. But gradually the ripples became more violent. And behind the glass I could see something moving, shapes pressing against the mirror from the other side, trying to break through. When I finished reading the ritual, my mouth closed and control of my body returned. I stumbled to my feet, moving away from the mirror, the book, everything. But it was too late. The mirror cracked. A fissure appeared in its center, spreading like a spider web. And from the fissure, something began to seep. It was neither liquid nor gas, but something in between. Tangible darkness spilled from the mirror like ink in water. And from that darkness, they emerged. The hungry. They had no fixed form. They were a mass of shadows that constantly shifted, vaguely taking on humanoid shapes before dissolving into something completely different. Where their faces should have been, there were black voids with what appeared to be mouths, circular openings filled with needle-like teeth arranged in spirals. And they were hungry. I could feel it emanating from them like heat from an oven. A hunger that had been unsatisfied for centuries, contained behind seals and barriers, finally unleashed. They moved towards me, gliding over the ground without really touching it. The voices in my mind were now a chorus. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you for opening the door for us. Now, as is customary, the one who opens the door must be the first to feed us. I stepped back, stumbling over boxes of books. No, I didn't know. I didn't want to. But you did. You read the ritual. You broke the seals. Your intention doesn't matter. The consequences are the same. The closest creature extended what could be an arm. When its shadow touched me, I felt something being pulled from me. Not physically, but something deeper. Life energy. Memories. Emotions. Everything being drained like water through a drain. I fell to my knees, suddenly exhausted. And as the creatures moved closer, I saw my life flowing towards them, feeding them, making them more solid, more real in our world. I was going to die here. In the basement of a library, drained until I became an empty shell by entities I had foolishly unleashed. But then, something else appeared. Another figure materialized in the basement, but this one was different. It looked human, a middle-aged man dressed in the black habit of a 17th century Catholic priest. And when he spoke, the creatures stopped. "Enough!" he commanded with a voice that resonated with authority. "She is ignorant of the true laws. She cannot be claimed under the rules of the ancient pact." The creatures turned to him. "Brother Augusto, you have been watching, always watching, waiting. I knew that eventually someone would find my book. I had hoped it would be someone more prepared. But it doesn't matter. The rules are clear. Only a voluntary practitioner who fully understands the consequences can be claimed as payment for opening the portal." "She read the ritual," the creatures protested. "Under compulsion. You forced her. That nullifies the contract." Brother Augusto turned to me. "But the portal is open, and it must be closed properly or more of the hungry will cross." "How?" I managed to ask weakly. "There is a closing ritual in the book, but it requires a sacrifice. Someone must stay on their side when the portal closes, acting as a living seal." "You?" He nodded sadly. "I have been waiting for this moment for nearly 400 years. When the Inquisition captured me, I managed to escape through the spiritual realms using the same knowledge I had learned. But I was trapped between worlds, neither fully dead nor fully alive. This is my chance to finally find rest. What do I need to do?" Brother Augusto indicated the book to me. "Read the sealing ritual. It's in the last pages. When you finish, the portal will close with me and with them on the other side." I took the book with trembling hands and found the ritual. It was in Latin, but this time I understood the words somehow, as if the knowledge had been implanted in my mind by the previous ritual. I began to read. The words flowed from me, and I felt power moving through the basement. The mirror began to glow with a white light that pulsed in sync with my reading. The creatures roared with fury, trying to reach me to stop me, but Brother Augusto stood between them and me, creating some kind of barrier with his remaining energies. "Quick!" he shouted. "I can't hold them off much longer." I read faster, the Latin words becoming a torrent. The light from the mirror intensified to blinding, and then, with one last phrase, the ritual was completed. The mirror exploded. Glass fragments flew everywhere, but instead of falling, the fragments were pulled towards where the mirror had been, forming a vortex, and in that vortex, the hungry and Brother Augusto were sucked in. I heard their last word before disappearing: "Forgive." The vortex closed. The glass fragments fell to the ground. The basement was left in absolute silence. I stayed there trembling, barely able to process what had happened. The grimoire in my hands suddenly felt heavy. I looked at it and saw that the pages I had opened were darkening, the words disappearing as if they were written in ink that was evaporating. In moments, all the pages of the ritual were blank. The knowledge had been consumed in the closing of the portal. The book was now just an inert historical artifact. I left the basement and went straight to the library director's office the next day. I told him I had had an accident with the mirror in the basement, that it had fallen and broken. I showed him the grimoire, but only the blank pages, explaining that it was probably just a blank notebook that someone had lavishly bound as a joke centuries ago. He accepted my explanation without questioning it. Why wouldn't he? The alternative was too absurd to consider, but I knew the truth. And I couldn't continue working in that basement, in that library, knowing what was there, what could still be there in other undiscovered books, in other sealed artifacts. I quit 2 weeks later. I left Montevideo completely, moving to Buenos Aires to start anew. Now I work in a modern bookstore that only sells books published in the last 10 years. Nothing old, nothing with a dark history. But sometimes, when I pass by mirrors, I see something in my reflection. A shadow that shouldn't be there. A movement in the periphery that disappears when I look directly. And I wonder if I really closed the portal completely, or if I left some crack, some residual connection between the hungry and our world. A connection that uses me as an anchor because I was the one who originally freed them. I have no answers. I only live with the uncertainty and the guilt of knowing that my curiosity almost destroyed the barrier between our world and something dark that had been contained for centuries. The grimoire of Brother Augusto remains in the rare book collection of San Ignacio University. It is probably now catalogued as a blank notebook from the 17th century, a historical curiosity without real value. But I know what it was, and I pray that no one else has the foolishness to investigate too deeply, to search for hidden seals, to attempt to restore the words that have faded from its pages, because the hungry are still there, on the other side, waiting, hungry, and they will always seek another opportunity to cross, another portal to open, another curious and ambitious soul that can be manipulated to break the seals that contain them. Brother Augusto sacrificed his eternal rest to close the portal that I opened. It is a sacrifice I cannot forget, nor a weight I can lay down. That is my story, my confession, and my warning. If you ever find a sealed book, pages stuck together with ancient wax and strange symbols, leave it closed. Some doors were sealed for very good reasons, and some things waiting on the other side must remain there forever. Thus ends Lucia's testimony. She told me that she still has nightmares about the hungry ones and that she completely avoids old books now. If you have ever worked in libraries, archives, or special collections and have encountered sealed or forbidden books, I would like to hear about your experience in the comments. Sometimes knowledge comes with a price we are not prepared to pay. Sleep well tonight. Recently, I received the testimony of Marco, a freelance photographer who agreed to document a witchcraft ritual in the mountains of Oaxaca. What his camera captured that night haunts him to this day. If you have experienced something that defies all logic, share it in the comments. I love reading each of your stories. What follows is disturbing, so prepare to delve into the darkest night Marco ever lived. My name is Marco, and I am a documentary photographer. For 15 years, I have traveled throughout Latin America, capturing cultures, traditions, and moments that others prefer not to see. I have photographed indigenous rituals, syncretic religious ceremonies, pagan festivals. I thought I had seen everything the spiritual world had to offer, until I met Don Esteban. It was October of last year. I was in Oaxaca working on a project about pre-Hispanic traditions that survive in rural communities. A local contact told me about Don Esteban, a sorcerer who supposedly practiced ancient magic, the real deal, not the tourist spectacle sold in markets. It's dangerous, my contact warned me. Don Esteban doesn't play. If you're going to photograph him, you must completely respect his rules. And what you see, you might wish you hadn't seen it. Of course, that only heightened my interest. I had documented ayahuasca shamans in Peru, santeros in Cuba, curanderos in Guatemala. I knew how to navigate those circles, how to show respect while capturing powerful images. I found Don Esteban in a small village called Santa Maria Yavesia, hidden in the mountains. His house was a modest adobe structure with a garden full of plants I didn't recognize. He was in his 70s, sun-weathered skin, deep black eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Are you here to mock what you don't understand?" was the first thing he said to me in Spanish with a strong Zapotec accent. I come to document with respect. I have photographed sacred ceremonies before. I know how to behave. Don Esteban studied me for a long time. Those who came before photographed performances. I do not perform. What I do is real, and the real has consequences. I understand. No, you do not understand, but you will learn. He paused. You need to be present at 3 ceremonies. Just 3. After that, you will leave and never return. Do you accept? I accept. Then come tomorrow at dusk, and bring only your camera. No electronics that have batteries or chips. The old does not like the modern. That night, in my hotel room, I checked my equipment. I had an old analog Pentax camera that I had inherited from my grandfather. Perfect for this. I bought several rolls of black and white film, the kind that war photographers used decades ago. The first ceremony was the next day. Don Esteban took me to a clearing in the woods, an hour's walk from the village. There was a circle of ancient stones covered in moss and carved symbols that glowed faintly in the light of the sunset. This is a cleansing, he explained. A woman from the village is sick. The doctors cannot help her. She says something is chasing her in her dreams, that it is consuming her from the inside. The woman arrived shortly after, accompanied by her husband. She was young, maybe 30 years old, but she looked emaciated, ill. She had deep dark circles under her eyes and was constantly trembling. Don Esteban began the ritual while I photographed from a respectful distance. He lit copal, the sweet smoke filling the clearing. He sang in Zapotec, words that sounded ancient, powerful. He passed herbs over the woman's body, tracing symbols in the air with a ceremonial knife. Through the viewfinder of my camera, I saw something extraordinary. Around the woman, barely visible as a distortion in the air, there was something dark. A shadow that did not correspond to any source of light. And while Don Esteban sang, that shadow writhed, as if it caused her pain. I quickly took photographs. The ritual lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the woman seemed better. The color had returned to her cheeks. She was no longer trembling. She thanked Don Esteban with tears in her eyes and left with her husband. "Did you see the shadow?" Don Esteban asked me. "Yes. I'm not sure what it was. It was what was killing her. A spirit sent by someone who envies her. Now she is free." He paused. "And you? Did you capture anything on your camera?" "I won't know until I develop the role. When you do, you will see things that your eyes did not see. The camera captures more than the visible." That night I couldn't sleep. There was something in the ritual I had witnessed, an authenticity I had never felt before. It was neither acting nor psychological suggestion. He had seen something real. The second ceremony was 3 days later. This time it was different. "It's a pact," Don Esteban explained as we walked to a different place in the mountains, deeper in the forest, where the trees grew so thick that hardly any daylight reached. "A man wants power. He is willing to pay the price." "What kind of power?" "The power to see the future, to know what is coming before it arrives. It's useful for business to avoid disasters, but it has a cost." We arrived at a natural cave on the side of a mountain. Inside there was a stone altar covered with black candles, animal skulls, and symbols painted with something that looked like blood. The man who wanted the power arrived at dusk. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, clearly wealthy. He looked nervous but determined. Don Esteban explained the rules to him. "You will receive the gift of foresight. You will see 3 days ahead in time. But every time you use this gift, you will age a week. Your life will shorten with each vision. Do you still want it?" The man hesitated for just a moment. "Yes." The ritual that followed was darker than the first. Don Esteban sacrificed a black rooster, letting its blood drip onto the altar. He sang in a language that was neither Zapotec nor Spanish, something older, more guttural. The air in the cave became heavy, difficult to breathe. I photographed everything, my hands trembling slightly. Through the viewfinder, I saw something that froze my blood. There was another presence in the cave. Not human. It manifested as a dark, dense shape near the altar, pulsating with its own life. Don Esteban called to this presence, speaking to it with respect mixed with caution. He offered the blood of the rooster, the man's hair, and something else I couldn't see clearly. The presence seemed to accept. It moved toward the man, momentarily enveloping him. He screamed, not in pain, but in shock. When it was over, the man had glassy eyes, as if he were seeing something that no one else could perceive. "It is done," said Don Esteban. "Now go, and remember the price." The man stumbled out of the cave. I followed him with my gaze until he disappeared among the trees. "Can you really see the future now?" I asked. "Yes, and he will regret it. They always regret it. The future is not meant to be seen. It changes those who know it." Don Esteban packed his ritual tools. "Tomorrow will be the third ceremony, the last, and the most dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "We will invoke something ancient, something that should not be disturbed but that sometimes needs to be awakened. I need you to understand, in this ceremony, if something goes wrong, I won't be able to protect you. You will be alone with your camera and your decisions." "What are we going to invoke?" "Here we call it the Devourer, a spirit that existed before the Spaniards arrived, before the Zapotecs built Monte Alban. It is old and hungry, but it is also just. It punishes those who deserve it." "And why invoke it?" "There is a man in the village who has done terrible things. He has raped girls, killed those who stood in his way. The police do not touch him because his family has money and power. But the Devourer cannot be bought." That night, back at my hotel, I seriously considered not going to the third ceremony. I had gotten incredible photographs from the first two. I already had more than enough material for my project. Why risk it? But curiosity, that damned curiosity that defines my profession, was stronger. I had to see. I had to document. On the third night, Don Esteban took me to the most remote place we had visited. We walked for 3 hours, using only the light of the full moon to guide us. We arrived at a cenote, a natural well of black water surrounded by ancient rocks. "This place is sacred," said Don Esteban. "Here sacrifices were made in ancient times. The spilled blood has saturated the earth. That's why the devourer can manifest here more easily than in other places." There were others present this time. 5 elders from the village, all dressed in white, all with serious expressions, and tied to a tree near the cenote, the accused man. He was large, burly, with an expression of absolute terror on his face. "Wait," I said to Don Esteban. We are not going to kill him. The devourer will decide his fate. If he is innocent, nothing will happen to him. If he is guilty..." He left the sentence unfinished. The elders formed a circle around the cenote. Don Esteban stood in the center, looking toward the black water. He began to sing, and the elders joined him. The melody was unsettling, dissonant, making my skin crawl. I photographed from outside the circle, as Don Esteban had instructed me. "No matter what happens, do not enter the circle. If you cross that line, the devourer will think you are also an offering." The singing continued for what seemed like hours. The moon rose in the sky, reflecting on the water of the cenote, and then gradually the water began to move. Not as if it were the wind, but as if something beneath was stirring it. Through my camera I saw bubbles rising from the depths, and then, emerging from the water, a shape. At first, it seemed to be just more water, taking a vague form. But it solidified, it defined itself. It was vaguely humanoid, but completely incorrect in its proportions. Arms too long, head too big, eyes that shone with their own yellowish light. Its skin, if it could be called that, seemed to be made of constantly flowing black water. The devourer. The bound man began to scream, struggling against his restraints. The screams were of pure, primal terror. The devourer moved toward him, gliding over the ground without really walking. Don Esteban spoke in that ancient language, presenting the accused, listing his crimes. The devourer stopped in front of the man, leaning down to look him directly in the eyes. What happened next was so horrible that I almost stopped photographing. The devourer reached out a hand toward the man's chest. The fingers, like water tentacles, penetrated through the clothes, the skin, entering his body. The man stopped screaming. His eyes turned white, and then, horrifically, he began to wither. It was like watching someone age 100 years in minutes. The skin wrinkled, the hair turned white and then fell out. The muscles atrophied. In 5 minutes, what remained tied to the tree was little more than a mummified corpse. The devourer withdrew, satisfied with its judgment. It slid back into the cenote and disappeared beneath the black water, leaving only ripples that eventually calmed. The elders cut the bindings of the corpse and let it drop into the water. "This is how it is always done," Don Esteban explained. "The cenote claims the bodies of the guilty. They will disappear in days, completely consumed." He was in shock, barely able to process what he had witnessed. I had instinctively photographed everything, not really thinking about what I was capturing. "We're done," said Don Esteban. "You've seen the 3 ceremonies. Now go and don't come back." "I need to develop these photographs." "Do it. But be careful with what you do with them. Showing this kind of truth to the world has consequences." I returned to the city 2 days later, with the 3 undeveloped rolls of film in my bag. I took them to a lab specialized in analog photography, one where I personally knew the technician. "Marco, it's been years since you worked with film," he commented as he received the rolls. "Special project?" "Something like that. Be very careful with these. They are important." We developed them together in the dark room. When the first images began to appear in the developing liquid, my technician let out a low whistle. "What the hell did you photograph?" The images from the first ceremony clearly showed the shadow around the sick woman, but it was more defined in the photograph than what I had seen with my eyes. It almost had a human shape, with claws reaching out toward the woman, as if it were embracing her, and his face, barely visible, was a grimace of pure malice. The images from the second ceremony were even more disturbing. The presence in the cave appeared as a dark, dense mass with what seemed to be multiple bright eyes, and in one particular photograph, one of those eyes was looking directly at the camera, as if it knew it was being photographed. But the images from the third ceremony, those were the ones that kept me awake for weeks. The devourer was clearly present in every photo. But it was not just a creature. In the images, you could see through its translucent form, and inside it were faces, dozens of them. Faces of people who seemed to be screaming, trapped within the entity. Souls of the guilty that I had judged throughout the centuries. And in the last photograph, the one I took just before the devourer retreated to the cenote, it was looking directly at my camera, and behind it, blurry but unmistakable, was me. Not my reflection, but me standing inside the circle, as if the photograph captured not what I was, but what I could have been if I had made the mistake of crossing that line. "These photos are incredible," my technician said. "You could win awards with this. What kind of effects did you use?" "There are no effects. It's all real." He looked at me as if I were crazy. "Marco, whatever you're saying, these images are disturbing. What do you plan to do with them?" "Good question. I had documented something extraordinary, visual proof of the supernatural. I could publish these photos, create an exhibition, write a book. My career would take off. But I remembered Don Esteban's words. Showing this kind of truth to the world has consequences. I stored the photographs in a sealed envelope and left them in my apartment. For days I thought about what to do. Then the dreams began. Every night I dreamed of the cenote. In the dreams I stood on its shore looking at the black water. And every night, something emerged from the water. Not the devourer, but something different each time. Shadows, spirits, entities that wanted to be seen, to be known, to be freed. And all of them whispered the same thing to me. "Show us, reveal us, let the world see us." I began to fall ill. Constant low-grade fever, headaches, nausea. The doctors found nothing wrong, but I knew what it was. The photographs, the entities I had captured, wanted something from me. I called Don Esteban using the number he had given me for emergencies. I told him about the dreams, about the illness. "The images are cursed," he simply said. "You captured something that was not meant to be captured. Now those entities have a connection to you through the photographs. They want to be released into the world, and you are their door. What should I do? Destroy the photographs, burn them. It's the only way to break the connection. But it's my job. It's the proof of everything I saw. Then keep one, just one, the one you consider most important. But the rest must be destroyed, or they will consume you." That night, I spread all the photographs across my table. There were 36 in total, 12 from each ceremony. Each one was extraordinary in its own way, showing aspects of the spiritual world that few people had seen and even fewer had documented. Choosing one was the hardest decision of my career. Finally, I selected a photo from the first ceremony. It showed Don Esteban with his arms outstretched, the copal smoke swirling around him, and the dark shadow being expelled from the sick woman. It was powerful, beautiful in its strange form, and less disturbing than the images of the devourer. I took the other 35 photographs to an empty lot outside the city. I burned them one by one, watching as the fire consumed the images of shadows, spirits, and ancient entities. As they burned, I felt something release. A pressure that had been in my chest since I revealed the photos gradually eased. The dream stopped that night. The fever disappeared the next day. But I had learned my lesson. There are truths that are not meant to be widely shared. Secrets that must remain in the shadows. Not everything that is real should be revealed. The only photograph I kept is now in my safe deposit box. I have never shown it publicly. I have never published it. Sometimes I look at it, remembering that night in Oaxaca, remembering that the world is much stranger and darker than most people want to believe. And sometimes, when I look at that photograph under the right light, I swear the shadows in it move slightly, as if the entities I captured were still there, trapped in that frozen moment, waiting. I have continued my work as a documentary photographer, but now I avoid certain subjects. I do not photograph real magic rituals, no document ceremonies that invoke spirits. I have learned that my camera, like any tool, has limits that should not be exceeded. 3 months ago, I received a message from someone in the town where I met Don Esteban. The message was brief. Don Esteban passed away peacefully. Before he died, he said to tell you that you chose wisely, that the doors you did not open are better sealed. I don't know if Don Esteban really said that or if it was the messenger's invention, but the words gave me a strange comfort. I had been on the edge of something vast and dangerous, and I had stepped back just in time. Sometimes I think about those photographs I burned, about the images of the devourer, about the faces trapped within its form. I wonder what would have happened if I had published them. Would the world have taken them seriously or dismissed them as photographic tricks? Would more people have sought out Don Esteban and others like him, asking for power, revenge, forbidden knowledge? I don't know. And I'm glad I don't know. Because some questions are better left unanswered. Some doors are better left closed, and some truths are better left in the darkness where they belong. But I have that one photograph. My reminder that magic is real, that spirits exist, that the invisible world is right next to the visible one, separated only by a thin veil that sometimes in certain places, under certain circumstances, becomes transparent. And every time I look at that photograph, I remember Don Esteban's warning. The camera captures more than the visible. He was right. My camera captured truths that should never have been seen. And although I destroyed most of those images, the memory remains. Imprinted not on film, but in my mind. Impossible to burn. Impossible to forget. I now live with that knowledge. With the certainty that we walk surrounded by forces we do not understand. That our rational and orderly world is just a thin layer over something much older, wilder, more dangerous. And although I no longer photograph those hidden worlds, I know they are still there. In remote mountains of Oaxaca, in dark cenotes, in forgotten caves. Waiting for those who are curious enough or foolish enough to seek them out. I was both, and I was lucky to return. That is the story Marco shared with me. He told me he still has that unique photograph saved, but he will never show it to the public. There are things, he said, that are better left hidden. If you have ever captured something in a photograph that shouldn't be there, tell me in the comments. Sometimes the camera sees what our eyes prefer to ignore. Rest well, and we'll meet in the next story. I want to share something that I recently received from a listener who signs as Mauricio. He wrote to me from a city in the north, telling me that he has been carrying this story for years and has never found a way to tell it to someone without feeling like they looked at him as if he had lost his mind. So he wrote it to me. If you also have something like that stored away, you know where to find me. What Mauricio experienced happened when he was 32 years old and agreed to stay for a few months at the family home of a co-worker, an old house on the outskirts, while he resolved a housing issue. What he didn't know was that this house had a guest who had been there much longer than either of them. Rodrigo's house was 40 minutes from the center, along a road that during the day seemed perfectly normal and at night acquired that quality of roads that no one uses after a certain hour. Not because there is anything wrong with them, but simply because there is no reason to be there. Rodrigo offered me the guest room when he found out I was looking for a place to stay after the owner of my apartment decided to sell it with 2 weeks' notice. It was a genuine gesture. Rodrigo and I had been working at the same company for 3 years. We got along well enough for co-workers, and he lived alone in that big house he had inherited from his parents, which had more space than one person alone needed. "It's temporary," he told me when we agreed. "Whatever you need, no rush." I thanked him. I packed my suitcase, loaded the boxes with the essentials, and moved in on a Saturday in October. The house was 2 stories, probably built in the 60s, with that solidity of construction from back then that made the walls have a thickness that modern houses no longer have. A neglected front garden, a side garage, a large kitchen that smelled of old wood, and on the upper floor, 4 rooms of which Rodrigo used 1 and the other 3 had not been used regularly for years. Mine overlooked the backyard, had a wide window, and a bed that creaked but was comfortable. It wasn't an apartment in the center, but it wasn't bad either. The first few days were about adapting, learning the rhythms of the house, that the water heater took time to heat up, that the 3rd staircase from the bottom creaked with a particular note that after a while I stopped consciously hearing. Learning Rodrigo's rhythms as well, who got up early and went to bed late, and who practically disappeared into his room on weekends with music and headphones. It was an easy coexistence, quiet, without complications, until the 2nd week. The first hint was the smell. It was diffuse at first, something I briefly perceived upon entering the hallway of the upper floor, and that disappeared before I could identify it. An organic, damp smell, similar to wet earth or decomposed leaves, which had no obvious source in a house that, although old, was clean and well maintained. I mentioned it to Rodrigo one morning while we were having breakfast. He looked up from his coffee. "What kind of smell?" he asked. I described it as best as I could. Earth, leaves, something organic and cold. Rodrigo nodded slowly, as if the description confirmed something he already knew. Sometimes it happens, he said. The house is old. The humidity rises from the foundations at certain times of the year. It was a reasonable explanation. I accepted it. But that night, when I went to the bathroom past midnight, the smell was in the hallway with an intensity that had nothing to do with the dampness of the foundations. It was dense, present, as if something wet and cold had been there recently. And it came from the room at the end of the hallway, the one that always remained closed, the one I had assumed was simply another unused room. I stopped in front of that door. The smell was clearly stronger there. I put my hand on the doorknob. It was cold, much colder than the rest of the things in that October night hallway. I didn't open it. I don't know exactly why. Something in the quality of that cold on the metal of the doorknob made my hand withdraw before I made a conscious decision about it. I went back to my room. I closed the door, and I spent a good while unable to sleep, listening to the silence of the hallway. I asked Rodrigo about that room the next day. It was casual, or at least I tried to make it sound casual. I asked him what was in there, if he kept things, if he used it for anything. Rodrigo took a moment to respond. He was washing the breakfast dishes with his back to me, and that moment of silence was long enough for me to notice that it wasn't the silence of someone thinking about how to describe a storage room. It was my brother's room, he finally said. I didn't know that Rodrigo had a brother. In 3 years of working together, he had never mentioned him. Does he live outside? I asked. Rodrigo took another moment. He died, he said, a long time ago, when we were kids. He placed the last dish in the drying rack and dried his hands. We never used that room after. My parents left it closed and I kept leaving it closed. A habit, I suppose. I'm sorry, I said. He nodded, with that gesture of someone accepting condolences for something so far in the past that it no longer hurts in the same way but has not completely disappeared either. There's nothing in there, he said. Just old furniture. I didn't ask again. But that night, from my room, I heard something coming from that room at the end of the hall. A soft, intermittent sound. It took me a while to identify it. It was the sound of a ball bouncing against the floor. Slow, irregular, like when someone drops it from their hand and catches it before it finishes bouncing. Again and again, for maybe 5 minutes. And then nothing. I lay completely still in bed, with my eyes open in the dark, processing what I had just heard. A ball, in the closed room of a child who had been dead for decades. I didn't tell Rodrigo immediately. I needed time to decide if what I had heard had any explanation other than the one my mind was insistently constructing. I spent the following days paying different attention to the house, not in a paranoid way, but simply with more care. And what I noticed when I started looking that way was that there were more things that didn't quite add up. The marks on the hallway wall, at a child's height, that I had seen from the first day without paying attention to them and that now, looking closely, had the shape of small hands. Not exactly dirt. Marks, as if someone had repeatedly rested their hands on the same spot for a long time. The picture that was on the stairs, which I had passed by hundreds of times without really looking and which was a family photo, Rodrigo's parents when they were young, with 2 children in front of them. One of them was Rodrigo, recognizable even at that age. The other was a smaller boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, looking at the camera with a serious expression that contrasted with the smiles of the others, and the temperature of the hallway on the upper floor, which was consistently colder than the rest of the house, even with the heating on, even on the warmest days of that October that had not yet finished cooling down. The 4th night after hearing the ball, I heard it again. The same sound, the same rhythm, from the same room, for about the same amount of time. I got up, I stepped out into the hallway. The temperature dropped suddenly as soon as I left my room. That specific cold I had already learned to recognize. The sound of the ball continued, soft and steady, from behind the closed door at the end. I walked over there. I stopped in front of the door. The sound continued for a few more seconds and then stopped. The silence that followed was of that kind that seems to have weight, that occupies space in a way that normal silence does not occupy. I raised my hand toward the doorknob, and then, from the other side of the door, someone said my name, not in an adult's voice, in a child's voice, clear, calm, without urgency or fear, just my name, pronounced with the naturalness of someone calling to someone they know. I withdrew my hand. I stepped back until my back touched the wall of the hallway across. I stood there without moving for what could have been 2 minutes, although I couldn't have determined it precisely. Absolute silence on the other side of the door. I went down the stairs, entered the kitchen, turned on the light, and sat at the table. And I stayed there until dawn. The next morning, I told Rodrigo everything. No beating around the bush, not looking for a way to soften it. I told him directly, the smell, the sound of the ball, the marks on the wall, and finally what happened that night, my name spoken in a child's voice from behind the closed door. Rodrigo listened to me without interrupting. He had his hands around his coffee cup and was looking at the table while I spoke with an expression that I didn't quite know how to read until I finished talking. It wasn't surprise. It was something more like the weary acknowledgement of someone confirming something they already knew. "How many times did you hear the ball?" he asked. "Twice," I said, with 4 days in between. He nodded. "It happened to me when I was a kid," he said. "After he died, I heard the ball. I saw things in the hallway at night, a small figure." He paused. "My parents told me it was grief, that it was a child's imagination who had lost his brother. They might have been right, but over the years I stopped hearing the ball and thought it was over." "How did he die?" I asked. Rodrigo took a while. "He was 7 years old," he said. "It was an accident. He fell down the stairs." His eyes briefly went to the stairs in the hallway and returned to the cup. "In this house, on those stairs." The silence that followed was long. "Why do you think it has come back now?" I finally said. Rodrigo looked at me. "I don't know," he said. "Nothing has happened for years." He paused. "Although my mother always said that Diego was looking for company, that he was a very sociable boy, that he didn't like to be alone." Another pause, longer. "And that the house had been empty for a long time. Diego. The dead brother was named Diego, and I was the first person to have slept in that house in years. That information changed something in the way I experienced the house. Not fear exactly, although fear was still there. It was something more complex than that. Because Diego, if it was Diego who inhabited that hallway and that closed room, had not done anything aggressive. He had done exactly what children do. Play with their ball, call someone by their name, seek attention, which was, in its own way, even more disturbing than if he had been threatening. Rodrigo asked me if I wanted to leave. He asked me directly, without pressure in any direction, with that honesty of his that I appreciated. I told him I wasn't leaving yet. I don't know exactly why I made that decision. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was something harder to name. A kind of curiosity that the situation had ignited in me and that I was still not ready to extinguish. That night I left the door to my room open. I lay in bed with the hallway light coming through the open frame, and waited. I don't know exactly what I was waiting for. I hadn't rationalized it. I just left the door open and waited. Around 2 in the morning I heard the footsteps. Light, small, irregular, the kind of footsteps that a child's feet make on wood. They were coming down the hallway. They approached my door, and stopped at the threshold. I saw nothing. The hallway light illuminated the doorframe and the piece of hallway visible from my bed, and there was nothing there to be seen. But the temperature in the room dropped, that already familiar cold, and the feeling that there was something at that threshold was as concrete and physical as anything I had ever experienced in my life. I stayed still, breathing slowly, and then, in a very low voice, I said, "Hello, Diego." Silence. Then, in the hallway, a soft sound, like something dropping to the floor, and the sound of a ball bouncing, once, twice, and rolling until it stopped, and then nothing else that night. The following weeks were strange in a way that had no precedent in my experience. The house remained the house, Rodrigo remained Rodrigo, work remained work. But there was something more in the routine now. A presence that I had chosen, more or less consciously, not to ignore. The ball would occasionally appear in the hallway, in places where it hadn't been before. I would return it to the threshold of the closed room without making any comments about it. The smell of damp earth came and went. The temperature in the hallway was always colder than the rest, and sometimes, not every night, I would hear footsteps. Rodrigo and I talked about it in more depth one night when we were both awake late. He told me more about Diego, about how lively he had been, a noisy and curious child, one of those who always need to be doing something, always in motion, always with someone nearby, about how the house had changed after his death, that silence that settles in places where something has ended abruptly and never quite goes away. "Did you ever think about doing something?" I asked him. "I don't know. Someone who would come, who would do something." Rodrigo looked at me with an expression that wasn't exactly negative. "My mother tried it once," she said, "years after he died. Someone came, did things, said words." She paused. "That week was the worst I remember in this house, as if what they had done was not to calm him but to disturb him. After that, my mother decided it was better to leave him in peace. She looked at me, and I have followed that logic ever since. It was a logic I understood better than I would have expected. The most intense moment occurred on a Sunday afternoon when Rodrigo had gone out and I was alone in the house. I was in the kitchen reading when I heard a sound coming from the upstairs. Not the ball this time. Something different. A dry, unique thud, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor upstairs. I went up. The hallway was empty and cold as always. Diego's room door was still closed. I checked the other rooms. Everything in order. Nothing fallen. Nothing out of place. I stopped in front of Diego's door. And at that moment, for the first and only time during all the time I spent in that house, the door opened. Slowly. Without violence. As if someone on the other side had turned the knob and gently pushed. The door opened about 30 centimeters and stopped, leaving a partial view into the room. What I saw was exactly what Rodrigo had described. Old furniture, a small bed with the mattress without sheets, a desk with a chair, a dark wooden wardrobe, and on the desk a red rubber ball, the kind that children used decades ago, perfectly still in the center of the wooden surface. That was all. There was no one. The room was empty and still, and smelled exactly like what I had learned to recognize, damp earth and something cold and ancient. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I said softly, "It's okay, Diego," and I carefully closed the door. I left that house 2 months later, when I found an apartment that fit what I was looking for. I said goodbye to Rodrigo on a Saturday morning, loaded my boxes into the car, and before leaving, I went up the hallway on the second floor for the last time. I stopped in front of Diego's door. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that didn't sound ridiculous or insufficient. I just stood there for a moment, with my hand a few inches from the door without touching it. The hallway was cold, as always. And then, very softly, from the other side, the sound of the ball bouncing. Once, twice, and silence. I went down the stairs, shook Rodrigo's hand, and left. That was 2 years ago. Rodrigo still lives in that house. We talk from time to time, and when I ask him about the house, he tells me that everything is the same. The ball in the hallway from time to time, the cold, the smell. He once asked me if I regretted opening the door to my room that night of saying hello. I told him no. And it's true, I don't regret it. But there is something I took away from that experience that doesn't quite fit anywhere comfortable in my head. Diego died at 7 years old. He fell down the stairs. And he has been in that house, in that room for decades. Playing alone with his ball, seeking company. That is what weighs on me the most about everything I experienced there. Not the fear, not the moments of panic in the dark hallway, but that. A child who doesn't want to be alone and who has been alone for more years than I have lived. That is what Mauricio told me, and that is what I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I read it. End of Mauricio's testimony. He wrote to me at the end of the message that he hasn't returned to Rodrigo's house, but that he sometimes thinks about Diego and that red ball on the desk. I believe there is something in this story that touches something different from the usual fear, something closer to sadness. If something similar happened to you, if you ever felt someone's presence in a place who didn't want to leave, write to me or leave it in the comments. Every story has its own weight, and if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe. There are many more stories like this waiting to be heard. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. A A follower of the channel shared with me this experience they lived 2 years ago when they inherited a house in a rural village in Michoacan, Mexico. What they found in the basement and what happened next forced them to sell the property for a fraction of its value and move to another city. If you have inherited properties from deceased relatives and felt that something of theirs or something darker was trapped within those walls, I would love for you to share it below. Now, this is the story of Mateo and the cursed legacy that his grandmother left him without warning. My name is Mateo, and until 2 years ago, I lived a completely normal life in Guadalajara. I worked as an accountant, had a comfortable apartment, and a girlfriend I planned to marry. Everything changed when I received the news that my maternal grandmother, Doña Socorro, had passed away at 93 years old in her house in the village of San Miguel del Monte, in the mountains of Michoacán. I hadn't seen my grandmother in over 10 years. Our family had distanced itself from her after my mother died when I was 15. My grandmother blamed my father for my mother's death, even though it had been cancer, something no one could prevent. The relationship became so toxic that we simply stopped visiting her. The lawyer who handled her will contacted me. I was her only direct heir. She left me her house, her land, and all her belongings. The lawyer mentioned that there was a condition. I had to spend at least 3 nights in the house before deciding whether to sell it or keep it. Your grandmother was very specific about this, the lawyer said over the phone. She said you needed to understand something before deciding. She didn't explain what, just that you had to stay in the house. It seemed strange to me, but I accepted. 3 nights were nothing, and the property was easily worth several million pesos. I could sell it and use the money for a down payment on a house for my girlfriend and me. I drove to San Miguel del Monte on a Friday afternoon. The town was small, perhaps 300 inhabitants, clinging to the slope of a mountain covered with pines and oaks. My grandmother's house was on the outskirts, isolated from the town by a 2-kilometer dirt road. It was an old construction of adobe and stone, 2 stories high, with a red tile roof. The gardens were neglected, overrun with weeds. The windows had closed wooden shutters, giving the house a blind and closed appearance. I used the key that the lawyer had given me to open the front door. The interior smelled musty, of years of solitude and accumulated dust. The furniture was covered with white sheets, like ghosts of a past life. I explored the ground floor. There was a spacious room with a fireplace, an old kitchen with a wood stove, a formal dining room that probably hadn't been used in decades. Everything was frozen in time, as if my grandmother had stopped making changes to the house at some point in the 70s. I went up to the second floor. There were 3 bedrooms. I chose the one that seemed to have been the guest room. I didn't want to sleep in my grandmother's room. The bedroom had a single bed with a mattress that smelled of dampness, a carved wooden wardrobe, and a window that overlooked the dark woods surrounding the property. After settling in, I decided to explore the rest of the house while there was still light. It was then that I found the basement door, hidden behind a heavy pantry in the kitchen. The door was locked with an old padlock, but the key was hanging on a hook right next to it, as if my grandmother wanted it to be found. On the door, carved into the wood, were words in what seemed to be Nahuatl, the indigenous language of the region. I couldn't read them, but something about them made me uncomfortable. I opened the padlock and the door swung inward, revealing stone stairs that descended into darkness. A smell rose from below. Incense, copal, and something organic that I couldn't identify. I used my phone's flashlight to light the way as I went down. The stairs were steep and worn from use. The stone walls were damp, covered in moss in some places. The basement was larger than expected, extending beneath the entire footprint of the house, and what it contained made me stop dead in my tracks. It was not an ordinary basement. It was an altar, a complete ceremonial space dedicated to something that clearly was not the Catholicism that my grandmother publicly professed. In the center, there was a long table covered with a black tablecloth. On it, dozens of candles of different colors, most consumed to mere puddles of wax. There were clay figurines representing figures I did not recognize, some human, others mixing human and animal traits. There were jars filled with herbs, dark liquids, powders of strange colors, and on the back wall, painted directly on the stone, there was a huge mural. It depicted a female figure surrounded by snakes, holding something that looked like a bleeding heart in one hand and a skull in the other. Her eyes were open too wide. Her mouth smiled with too many teeth. Below the mural were books, ancient grimoires, some in Spanish, others in Nahuatl, one in what appeared to be Latin. I leafed through them with trembling hands. They were books of magic, of rituals, of invocations to entities that the church would have considered demonic. My grandmother had been a witch, a practitioner of black magic combining folk Catholicism, pre-Hispanic indigenous traditions, and something darker that I could not fully identify. And in one of the books, I found pages marked with my name, not just my name, but dates. My birth, my mother's death, my college graduation. Every important event in my life was documented along with symbols and annotations in the margins. There was a large envelope on the altar table with my name written in my grandmother's shaky handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a letter and an object wrapped in black cloth. The letter said, "Mateo, my dear grandson, if you are reading this, it means you have finally found my true chapel, the place where I have worked for over 70 years. I know your father raised you to be skeptical, not to believe in these things, but you need to understand the truth about our family, about your mother, and about the price I have paid to keep you alive. When your mother fell ill with cancer, I did what any desperate mother would do. I sought power beyond what the doctors could offer. I found that power in the ancient traditions of our ancestors, in the pacts that one can make when willing to pay the price. I made a deal with the lords of the mountain, the ancient entities that have inhabited these mountains since before the Spaniards arrived. I offered them sacrifice and service in exchange for healing your mother. But the lords are deceitful. Yes, they cured her cancer technically, but they transferred it, not back to her, but to you. You were supposed to have died from that cancer at 16. When I realized the deception, I made another pact, a darker pact. I offered my own life, artificially extended through rituals, as collateral. As long as I lived and continued the rituals of service, you would live free from the disease. But now I am dead, and the pact needs to be renewed or terminated. The wrapped object is the stone of the covenant. It is the physical anchor of the agreement between our family and the lords. If you destroy it, the covenant will break, and the cancer you were meant to have at 16 will catch up with you. You will die in weeks. If you keep it and learn the rituals in the books I have left, you can continue the covenant. But it comes at a price. The lords demand service, rituals every new moon, specific offerings, and every 5 years, a greater sacrifice. I do not expect you to forgive me for binding you to this without your knowledge, but I do not regret it either. You are my blood, and I would do anything to keep you alive. The choice is now yours. I asked for 3 nights because that is how long it takes the lords to present themselves once the guardian of the covenant has died. They will come for you before dawn on the 3rd day. You must decide before then. With eternal love and infinite apologies, your grandmother Socorro. My hands trembled so much that I almost dropped the letter. I unwrapped the object. It was a stone the size of my fist, black as obsidian but with red veins that seemed to pulse with their own light. It was warm to the touch, and when my fingers touched it, I felt something, a heartbeat, as if the stone were alive. I dropped the stone as if it burned and ran up from the basement. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. My grandmother had been senile in the end, clearly. This was just the fantasies of an old woman who had lost touch with reality. But then I remembered something. When I was 16, just after my mother died, I became seriously ill. The doctors couldn't diagnose what was wrong. High fever, weight loss, unbearable pain. They ran all kinds of tests, including full scans looking for cancer. They found nothing, and after 3 weeks the symptoms simply disappeared. The doctors called it a severe viral infection that had run its course, but they never identified what virus. Could it have been? No, I couldn't afford to believe in this. I spent the first night in the house awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, trying to rationalize what I had found. In the morning, I drove to town to talk to people who might have known my grandmother. What I discovered chilled my blood. Everyone in the village knew what my grandmother was. They called her the healer, but the title came with fear, mixed with respect. She had cured diseases, yes, but she had also cursed people. She had performed rituals that people whispered about but never spoke of directly, and everyone mentioned the lords of the mountain. It was a local belief that in the mountains surrounding the village lived ancient entities, neither gods nor demons exactly, but something in between. Entities that had been revered by pre-Hispanic cultures and had never really left. Your grandmother was the only one who could communicate with them, an old man told me in the only cafe in the village. She made pacts on behalf of others. She always warned that there was a price, but desperate people do not heed warnings. What kind of price? I asked. The old man looked at me with tired eyes. It depends on the pact. Sometimes it's continuous service, sometimes it's sacrifice. It's always more than what people expect to pay. I returned home more confused and scared than before. Part of me just wanted to leave, drive back to Guadalajara, forget all of this. But my grandmother's letter obsessed me. What if it was true? What if I really had latent cancer that only the rituals had contained? The second night was worse than the first. I heard things. Movement in the woods around the house. Scratches on the outside walls. And from the basement, I could swear I heard voices singing in that ancient language I didn't understand. At midnight, I forced myself to go down to the basement again. I needed to understand. My grandmother's books were all there. I started reading them using my cell phone to translate the parts in Nahuatl. What I found was a story of generations. My grandmother had not been the first. Our family had been involved with the Lords of the Mountain for at least 5 generations. Each guardian of the pact learned the rituals and passed them on to the next. But my mother had broken the cycle. She had refused to learn the rituals, married my father, and moved far away. And when she fell ill, my grandmother had brought her back to this basement, to this altar, and had renewed the pact by force. The details of what my grandmother had sacrificed over the years were meticulously documented. Animals at first, then more valuable things. Years of her own life, precious memories that she literally forgot after offering them, skills that she lost permanently, and every 5 years the greater sacrifice. I found records of 3 of these sacrifices. They did not specify what exactly she had sacrificed, only that after each one, she had been physically ill for weeks and had visibly aged years in days. The last major sacrifice had been 6 years ago. The next would have been due in another year, but my grandmother had died before, passing the responsibility to me. At dawn on the 3rd day, I was exhausted but still awake. I had made a decision. I would destroy the stone, break the pact. If I truly had cancer, I would rather face it with modern medicine than bind myself to serve dark entities for the rest of my life. I took the stone from the altar and carried it outside. I found a large rock and prepared to crush it. But the moment I lifted the stone above my head, I felt something. A sharp pain in my chest, then in my stomach, then spreading throughout my body like liquid fire running through my veins. I fell to the ground, the packed stone rolling out of my hands. The pain was unbearable, as if every cell in my body was being consumed from the inside. And then I saw them, emerging from the forest. 3 figures. They were not completely solid. They were like 3-dimensional shadows, shapes that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. They were vaguely humanoid, but too tall, too thin, with limbs extending in impossible proportions. The grandson of Socorro, one said, her voice resonating directly in my mind. The last of the line, the pact must continue or it must end. Choose now. I don't want this, I managed to say between waves of pain. Then die. Another of the figures replied, the illness that your grandmother contained for 22 years will be unleashed. You will have perhaps 2 weeks before your body completely fails. Oh, said the 3rd figure, accept the pact, learn the rituals, serve as your grandmother served, and you will live a long life with power that few mortals know. The pain intensified. I could feel something growing inside me, cells multiplying out of control exactly like the cancer that had killed my mother. What is the real price? I asked. Continuous service, replied the 1st figure. Rituals every new moon, offerings of life energy, yours and that of others seeking our favor, and every 5 years you must bring us a soul, someone who willingly agrees to serve in your place for a period. Their service feeds the pact for another 5 years. What happens to those souls? They are transformed. They become part of us, eternal servants in the realm between worlds. It is not death, but it is not life as you know it either. I saw my future unfolding before me in 2 paths. In one, I rejected this and died painfully within weeks. In the other, I accepted and became what my grandmother had been, a witch in service of forces I did not fully understand, manipulating the life and death of others to maintain a corrupt pact. And I made the most cowardly and selfish decision of my life. I accept, I whispered. Immediately, the pain disappeared. The cancer that had been growing stopped, reversed, vanished as if it had never existed. I felt stronger, more alive than I had been in years. The figures approached. One of them extended what could be called a hand. I took it and felt energy flowing from them to me. Knowledge. The rituals were implanted in my mind like memories I had always had. The pact is renewed, they said in unison. You have 5 years until the first major sacrifice. Use that time wisely, learn the rituals well, and remember, trying to break the pact after accepting it results in consequences worse than mere death. They faded back into the forest, leaving me alone in my grandmother's garden at dawn. That was 2 years ago. I have performed the rituals every new moon. I have used the knowledge I inherited to heal some, to curse others who have offended me. I permanently moved to my grandmother's house away from my previous life in Guadalajara. My girlfriend broke up with me when I couldn't explain why I suddenly needed to live in a remote mountain village. I left my job as an accountant. Now I am the healer of the village, just as my grandmother was the healer. And in 3 more years, I will have to make my first major sacrifice. I will have to find someone willing to accept an offer that sounds too good to be true, who will voluntarily sign their soul to serve the lords of the mountain. I have already started identifying potential candidates. Desperate people, sick people, people who believe they have nothing to lose. It's easier than you would think. Desperation makes people accept terms they would never consider under normal circumstances. I hate myself for what I have become, but I would hate myself more for being dead. So I carry on. I perform the rituals. I learn more from my grandmother's books. And I prepare for the day when I will have to look someone in the eyes and convince them to give up their soul to extend my own cursed pact. Sometimes I wonder if my grandmother struggled with the same guilt, if each of the guardians of the pact before me felt this same weight. The books do not say. They only document the rituals, the sacrifices, the dates. Nothing about how they felt doing it. The house is now truly mine. I partially remodeled it, updating the kitchen and bathrooms. But the basement remains exactly as my grandmother left it. It is my chapel now, the place where I kneel before the mural of the dark goddess and sing in ancient tongues under the new moon. And every night when the forest darkens and I hear movement among the trees, I know that the lords of the mountain are watching, ensuring that I fulfill my part of the pact, waiting for the next sacrifice I owe them. 3 more years, just 3 years before I have to completely destroy the life and soul of another person to save my own. And I will, because I am a coward, because I value my life more than my morality. Because once you accept the pact, there is no true way out except forward, deeper into the darkness. My grandmother knew this. That's why she left me the letter, the stone, the house. She wasn't giving me a real choice. She was making sure that the family pact continued, that another generation served the lords of the mountain. And it worked. I am the guardian of the pact now. And in some future, if I have children, one of them will inherit this basement, these books, this pulsating stone that beats like a dark heart. The cycle continues, as it has continued for 5 generations. As it will continue as long as there is someone of our blood willing to sacrifice their humanity for a few more years of life. That is the true price of the pact, not just the rituals or the occasional sacrifices. It is what makes you yourself. How it transforms you from a person into a tool, from human into a conduit for forces that should not be served. My grandmother lived to 93. If I continue the pact faithfully, I might too. Decades more of artificially extended life, bought with the souls of others. Is it worth it? Ask me in 3 years, after the first major sacrifice. Ask me if I can still look at myself in the mirror after condemning someone to eternal servitude. But I probably already know the answer. Because if my grandmother could do it 5 times and the guardians before her did it dozens of times more, then I can too. Because in the end, we are all weaker than we think. We are all capable of greater darkness than we admit. And all of us, when we face our own mortality, discover exactly how much we are willing to sacrifice of ourselves and others to keep living one more day. That was Mateo's testimony. He contacted me a month ago, and by the date, I estimate he has about a year left before his first major sacrifice. I don't know if he will actually do it or if he will find another way out. If you have ever found yourself caught in an impossible decision where all the options seem terrible, share it in the comments. Sometimes the choices we make in moments of fear define us more than we would like to admit. Rest in peace, and see you in the next story.